One of the keys to understanding the Bible is understanding some of the background, the political background, the empires that were involved. Because in reality, Israel was very small. There were around, their heyday was very brief, and it was at a time when most of the other empires were at their low point. And these other empires are lots bigger, much more geography, more people, and so on. And so first, the dates that are going to be important, and these dates will continue to show up again as we go through looking at the Old Testament. I'll use a date about 2000. These are all BC. 2000 for the time of Abraham, Sarah, and all those patriarchs, book of Genesis. That's a very rough estimate. And for Moses and the Exodus, I'll use the date 1275. Again, you will find dates all over the map. That's just a general middle of the road date that I've chosen to use. Just, don't consider it absolute, but general. David, strangely enough, really is, his reign actually starts at the year 1000, which just happens to work out very nicely. Obviously, they didn't know it was the year 1000 BC by then. So then you have David at 1000. By 722, you have the northern exile. So actually, back here, the kingdom split into the north and the south. The north was called Israel, the south called Judah. So first, the north went into exile, and then in 586, and again, you'll sometimes see 586, 87. This actually started a little earlier, was a process, but 586, you have the southern exile, that's Judah. Then you have the return from exile, which is mostly the return of the southern exile. And in 530-ish, again, that was a longer period. It happened over some time. And then you have Alexander the Great, who was Macedonian Greek, but he took over all the way from Egypt all the way toward India, a huge chunk of land. And then in 64, you have the time when the Romans took over the Bible lands today under Pompey the Great. So to look back at the empires themselves, first we have to remember that Egypt was an empire. It was very much on its own and very powerful because of the Nile. And Egypt sort of exists all throughout this. They're always there in some way or another. There's a point where they're under some of those who followed Alexander the Great. And then they're under the Roman the Roman jurisdiction, but they still kind of retain their own particular uniqueness. So the empire of Egypt is most important for this early part. So in the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they talk about Egypt, and remember Joseph goes to Egypt as a slave with the stories of the famine. Moses, of course, the people are led out of Egypt. Egypt is still a player around David, but pretty weak. Egypt will show up a little later. Actually, the king Josiah ends up dying in battle when he goes to meet one of the Egyptian leaders. But so Egypt kind of has a little higher point, but just kind of continues throughout. But they're the main empire for the beginning. A couple other empires going on at the time. Old Babylon, or their first Babylonian empire, and that would include Hammurabi, who was famous for his code of laws. So you have that old Babylonian empire that was seen from these other empires as the traditional ancient one. There's also the Hittite Empire, which was in what's Turkey today, and that's something that scholars have found out more in the last century or so than they used to know. Then the next empire you have that's kind of important in the area is Assyria. And Assyria is sort of in what is Iraq today. So you know where Syria is. So kind of the modern countries, Syria and Iraq, that's Assyria. And they were the ones that took out the northern kingdoms, Israel, the 10 tribes, and took them into exile. The northern kingdom was actually the larger, more powerful, and richer one. They almost came in and took out Jerusalem, but Jerusalem just barely made it by. Now, Assyria went along, but then came Babylonian Empire. They're a little further up or downriver. That's what is Iraq today. It's actually called officially the Neo-Babylonian Empire because it's not this same one. But they defeated Assyria, and they took over their land, And then they are the ones that took over the land of Judah and sent the southern tribes into exile. Now, Babylon was an empire for a while, but then the Persian Empire, which is a little further to the east and more in what is Iran today, they took over this Babylonian Empire. Now, one of the policies that Persia had was they would allow those who had gone into exile from these empires to go back home and actually sponsor rebuilding. And so Cyrus, who was the Persian leader at the time, allows the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. Actually, in the book of Isaiah, Cyrus is referred to as God's Messiah, anointed one, because he was a king and he was doing God's work of bringing the people back to their land. The Persian Empire lasted for quite a while, but then along came Alexander the Great. Just amazing. His father died, and I think he was about 19, and he began campaigns that his father had, where he swept down into the lands of the Bible, into Egypt, and all the way to India. He only lived to in his 30s, but when he died, this whole area was under him and his generals, and generally was a Greek. He was from Macedon, which is pretty much northern Greece, and this whole area then Greek was the main culture, and so Greek became the language that was used all throughout this huge empire and part of the culture as well. And so there, the Bible lands are under Greek influence. This is the book of Maccabees happens in this time frame as well. And then the Roman Empire, a little further west in the Mediterranean, started becoming more and more powerful and took over this whole area. So by 64 BC, Pompey the Great, who you might know from stories about Julius Caesar, he came and conquered the land of Israel, or what is today. And so then the people of God were under Roman empires, and that's where they continued into the New Testament under the Empire of Rome. And now to give you just a sense of some of the geography, I want to talk about these empires and where they were located. This is my very, very, very simplified cartoonish map of sort of the Eastern Mediterranean. I'll explain the parts as we go along. But we talked about Abraham and Sarah being under Egypt, and Egypt was down here. You have the Nile River, the Nile Delta. The Nile flows north. Its origin is down here in Africa. So you have Egypt, and of course Moses in the Exodus fleeing Egypt. This is Sinai. So this is the Sinai Peninsula. So the tradition of them going through the Red Sea, this is the Red Sea that they had passed through some part of that. They wandered in the Sinai Desert and then made their way up to where they were to cross the River Jordan into the land of Israel. Now the land of Israel, as you can see, is small. I probably made this a little smaller than it should be, but on the north you have the Sea of Galilee, and the River Jordan runs down into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is in the lowest elevation on Earth. It's well below sea level. The reason it's all salt is because water never runs out of it. It just always comes in, and so the salt has nowhere to go but evaporate. So you have David. The large kingdom here is just kind of in this area, and David is at that moment, I said, when these other kingdoms were at their weakest. When you get into the Assyrians, who took away the northern Israelites, that would have been around here. So you have Assyria. Again, this is very rough estimate. Then later, you had Babylon, who took over, and they took over the southern kingdom in 586. Babylon, from down here, kind of took over the larger area. And of course, by now Assyria had taken that. This is the Tigris-Euphrates River coming into the Persian Gulf. Then when the Persian Empire came, that was over here. So Persia further engulfed these empires. Then Alexander the Great, coming from up here in Greece, came across down into Egypt and then took over this whole land. Then Rome, which was over here and came a little later on the scene, Rome started having more and more influence throughout the Mediterranean, into Egypt, and eventually then Rome took over all of this area as well. Some of this part was never fully taken over by Rome, but by the time of the New Testament, Rome was all through North Africa, all the way up the coast of what is Israel, and Beirut, Lebanon, and Syria, and so on, and Turkey today, and Greece, and Rome, and all those, Italy, all those places. That was the Roman Empire at the time, a huge empire. And in the middle of all this is the Mediterranean Sea. So to give you a sense of geographically, the people of Israel is very small, and they were also kind of a point where Asia up here, and Europe over here, and Africa, where all of those came together. This was kind of the crossroads area for trade and so on. And so that's one reason why that land was always under dispute, one reason why it was being fought over, why all these different kingdoms came and went in that empire. So that's the basic geographical sense of those empires. A reminder about the timeline. Abraham, Sarah, about 2000. The Exodus with Moses, about 1275. David, right at 1000. 722, the northern kingdom goes into exile. 586, the southern kingdom, Jerusalem is destroyed. They return, and then in 333, they're under Alexander the Great. And 64 BC, they're under Rome, under Pompey the Great. So pretty much the whole story of the Bible is a story of a people surrounded and often overcome by large empires, powerful empires with huge armies. The one moment, as I said, when the people of God were at their high point was when all of these other empires were kind of at their lowest point, just a little blip in the history of the world. So if it wasn't for the Bible and people were looking at world history politically and geographically, there'd probably never be a mention of David or Israel. It was that small of a blip on the map. Important thing to know about these empires that were all around the people in the Bible is something about their religion, their culture. You can't really, there is no separate term for religion in this part of the world and in this time of history. So religion and culture are kind of all one thing. I'm going to focus more on the religious aspect of it. Much of this is called, today at least, is called the ancient Near East. Often people will call it now, the Middle East, we call it. It's considered the Near East now, because the Far East then would be out toward China and toward Japan. But now there's a push actually to rename it again, because that's very much looking from Europe or America, maybe considering it actually Western Asia. But anyways, ancient Near East is the typical term. First, there's Egypt. Two main points about Egypt is Pharaoh and the Nile. The Nile was very predictable and fairly consistent. It would rise, flood the land, and deposit rich soil, and then it would go back down, and there would be irrigation ditches to be able to irrigate the fields. Everything was very regular. Everything was very coordinated. It was very top-down and hierarchical. The Pharaoh was seen as a god manifest. The Pharaoh was one god as living, and then a different god as the dead Pharaoh. Pharaoh was very, very divine in that sense. The Nile, it was very predictable. So sometimes Egyptian religion is considered sort of conservative or just very consistent over time. One important term is ma'at, which would be sort of harmony or justice or goodness. And one of the traditional stories is of the pharaohs or some of the more elite figures when they would die. Their heart would be weighed on a scale with a feather or something, and it had to do with how much ma'at they had, if they had a lot or a little. And the idea, I guess the ma'at made the heart very light. If it was as light as a feather, they went on to their paradise. If it was heavier, though, and they didn't have a lot of that, then they went off to nothingness or punishment or where you didn't want to go. In the area of Mesopotamia, this would be Assyria and Babylon and also Persia, but Persia is a little different. In Mesopotamia, the key point about that is the rivers. And these rivers flood, and they're dramatic floods, and they're unpredictable, very much unlike the Nile. The word Mesopotamia just means in the middle of the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. One important religious text in this area is the Enuma Elish, which is just the first two words, when on high. And it's a story of how there is a battle among the gods, and Marduk was established as the head god, and Babylon was established as kind of the sacred center of the world. Very much focuses on this battle of the gods, and of the gods making a certain area, a place very holy, you might say. One of the other important texts, which was discovered actually much, much later, just a few centuries ago, was the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a story of one of the kings of the area who was supposedly part divine, part human, and he was just, because he was so divine, he was a little too boisterous, and the people were getting worried and upset, so they called out to the gods to do something, and the gods sent down kind of a wild man. Enkidu was his name. And originally, this wild man was there, it was going to battle with Gilgamesh. And then they have this battle, but then they become friends, and then they go out on all these adventures. And they defeat these monsters, and they do all these things. But eventually, Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh is overcome with grief. And he wants to figure out if there's a way to bring back his friend or to have eternal life, so he doesn't have to die. So he goes on this long journey, and in that journey to the underworld, he meets a guy who survived a worldwide flood. And that man then tells him the story. It's something called the flood myth of Mesopotamia. And so this man Atrahasis tells him the story about the flood. Eventually Gilgamesh figures out there's no way he can't live eternally. He returns and has to be happy with his city, with his name and honor living on. Persia, a little bit to the east, Iran today, their dominant kind of religion was called Zoroastrianism, and that is characterized by duality, sort of good and evil. The good god is called Ahura Mazda, and he is there fighting the evil, and there's a sense of punishment and reward for those who follow Ahura Mazda or those who don't. And also there's some talk about a final judgment. So actually a lot of things that people think about as sort of a Jewish Christian background to religion is somewhat closer to this than to these other religions. And then you have Greece and Rome, which later on aren't really part of the Old Testament, but part of the New. And their religion really kind of focuses on this conflict among the generations. Right? You have a son who kills his father, and a son kills the other father. You have the battle between the Titans and the Olympians. You've got these three main gods, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, and then other important gods like Apollo and Athena. Not going to get into all those details. But I think one thing to notice about these stories is these gods are very touchy, I would say. So part of what you want to do is make sure that you don't get them upset or get them against you. And so you want to figure out the right thing to do, because these guys can be dangerous, and you want to somehow please them. Two of the big religious texts for Greece and then Rome kind of took on a lot of the Greek religion. First, the writings of Homer from Greece, and that is about the Trojan War in Troy, heroes like Achilles and Hector and Ajax and all these people, and this great story of a heroic battle. And then Odysseus on his way home, battling all of these other creatures, the Cyclops, and making his way home. So you have this great epic journey. And then Rome has their own kind of epic called the Aeneid, which follows this guy Aeneas, who is he's supposed to be one of the Trojans, who actually, they were defeated, but then they were defeated and taken off. But then Aeneas, one of the Trojans, he went and settled in Italy and was the founder of Rome. So there's kind of a connection there. He makes a stop in northern Africa, falls in love with this queen there, but then has to leave her. And she's so distraught, she actually burns herself on this big pile because he's leaving her. So one thing to notice is in Egypt, the gods, they're very much larger than life. I think the overarching feeling is of awesomeness, right? They're very big and powerful and consistent and steady. Mesopotamia, the gods are in a way more scary. They are just like the rivers and the floods. You never know what's going to quite happen. It can be kind of scary. They're somewhat violent, unpredictable. In Persia, it's a little more predictable, but it is a battle. In Greece and Rome, I would say they're more touchy, right? You know, they're always getting offended by one another, and who knows if they might get offended by you, and they're part of these forces bigger than anyone. Now, when you look at like leadership based on this religion, in Egypt, the pharaoh is sort of God as a person, so practically divine. In Mesopotamia, the kings rule on behalf of the gods, so the gods appoint them, so what is later called divine kingship. But they're not gods themselves. I would say similar with Persia. The idea is that the leader needs to be on the right side, the side of Ahura Mazda. Greece and Rome, it doesn't seem like the leaders are appointed by the gods, but what the gods do really affects the leaders. So in all of these stories, in the stories of Homer and from the Aeneid, the fighting among the gods is often what determines what happens to the people. And so they're not appointed by them, but what the gods do really makes a big difference. So that's one way to think about some of the background to some of the Old Testament and New Testament. And then the biblical God of somebody who creates and loves and is interested in people and in history and in a particular place, and is a God of justice and all of these things. And in a lot of ways, there are some similarities, but a lot of contrasts too. And some of the Bible is almost written as a way to contrast the difference between these gods and the God of Israel. Some talk about the beginning of Genesis is really a counter story to these stories. And in fact, the gospel, talking about the gospel in the New Testament, gospel was a term that had been used when Roman leaders, generals or emperors had conquered. When someone would come and proclaim that they had conquered an area, that proclamation was the gospel, the good news. And the emperor was called Lord, right, king. And so when they say Jesus is Lord, the good news of Jesus, that's in a way very counter to the Roman understanding of things.